The LGBTQ movement has a recent but very storied history. Since the 1950s, there has been a movement in the United States trying to get equal rights for members of the LGBTQ community. Knowing the history of our fellow citizens' struggle is important, and most of the LGBTQ movement's history is very recent, with some of it happening within the last decade. First, let's discuss the early era of the LGBTQ movement, then the Stonewall riots and its role as a turning point in American LGBTQ history, and finally, the history of the movement after the Stonewall. First and foremost, let's discuss the early history of the LGBTQ community. Before the Stonewall riots, most American members of the LGBTQ community were persecuted by the legal system. Being so much as accused of being gay would often ruin an individual's career, and if one was found out to be in a same-sex relationship, there could often be legal repercussions, ranging anywhere from fines to life in prison. According to an interview of Randolph Wicker performed by Time magazine, being gay or trans was something to be hid. It was something one would only ever discuss with their partners or people they knew to also be in the early LGBTQ movement. At the time, there were few organized groups or protests. One of the most famous groups was the Mattachine Society, which Wicker was a member of. The Mattachines were a comparatively small group who had managed to win some cases in court and educate some people on LGBTQ topics, even holding protests in some cases. However, there were still some large acts performed. One such event was the Compton Cafeteria Riot, a protest of similar scale as Stonewall. According to an article from NPR, this was a riot that occurred in 1966 when police staged a raid on Gene Compton's cafe in San Francisco. A large group of trans women began to protest and fight back against the police officers who had attempted to arrest them. Even at the time, however, this went relatively unnoticed among all of the other protests that were happening during the Vietnam War and Civil Rights Movement. The Stonewall riots of 1969 are largely considered to be the major turning point in LGBTQ history, unifying the movement and making it publicly understood. According to Andrea Jenkins' Power to the People, The Stonewall Revolution, this series of riots began when police staged a raid on the Stonewall Inn in New York, a bar that was commonly understood to be frequented by members of the LGBTQ community. At some point during this raid, however, an individual, reportedly one of the trans women who frequented the bar, began to fight the police officers who were arresting her. This led to many of the other patrons who had been forced out of the bar to also begin fighting the police. The riots would go on for 2 days before calming down, although they would have major effects. One such effect of the riots was that members of the LGBTQ community started to be much more open about who they were, such as public displays of affection between same-sex couples or trans people being more open about their gender identity. It would also become the protest most commonly associated with the earlier LGBTQ movement, as it received more attention than any of the other protests or riots that had happened earlier. This, of course, would give the movement more publicity and the ability to make their messages clear, paving the way for the modern LGBTQ movement to become what it is today. Now that we've learned about the Stonewall riots, let's discuss the more recent history of the LGBTQ movement. According to a paper by G. M. Herrick and J. P. Capitanio, during the 1990s, the AIDS epidemic became a major issue among the gay community. Much of the progress made since the 1960s was lost due to the severe stigma surrounding gay men, who suffered heavily during the epidemic. In addition, in 1996, the Defense of Marriage Act was passed by Congress, which meant that same-sex marriages were no longer recognized by the U.S. federal government. This had the effect of making many rights and privileges held by heterosexual couples unavailable to same-sex couples. However, the 2010s held much more fortune for the LGBTQ community. In 2013, United States v. Windsor was ruled on by the Supreme Court, ruling that the third section of the Defense of Marriage Act, non-recognition of same-sex couples federally, was unconstitutional. Likewise, in 2015, Obergefell v. Hodge was ruled on by the Supreme Court, ruling that the Defense of Marriage Act itself was unconstitutional, making same-sex marriage legal and recognized in all states. As for the immediate future of the LGBTQ community, the Equality Act, introduced in 2015, now rests in the Senate, waiting to be debated and voted on. This act would amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to include sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity among the various different groups, given additional protections against discrimination. This has been a speech about the history of the LGBTQ community. The LGBTQ community has fought for a long time to obtain rights, first trying to pass themselves off as being considered normal for the 1950s, becoming a more unified and active movement after the Stonewall riots, and eventually gaining equal rights and protections during the 2010s. Despite being a very important event in the history of the American Civil Rights Movement, the LGBTQ community only gained their rights under the federal government very recently. Even with how important these events are, the LGBTQ movement still has a ways to go. Are you willing to help your fellow citizens become accepted?